Hello everyone and welcome back to another video on my channel. And today I'm going to be talking about how good every driver's season has actually been, but based off of metrics that aren't just the points table, because I feel like it can be quite deceiving when you look at some people's points tallies and positions in the championship when they haven't actually had a season that kind of matches that. For example, you could think of maybe Lance Stroll, for example, where he got loads of big point finishes, but would you really say he's had an amazing season? I don't think you would. So today I'm going to be looking at kind of who's flown under the radar, who is perhaps surprisingly doing better than you might think, because I think you will be surprised with some drivers as to how close they are to their teammate, but also just their performance in general. Um, so that's why I have made all of these driver graphics, if you will, um, and I'm going to be looking through all 20 races so far this season, and basically taking averages of A, their qualifying position, and B, their finishing position across all races. And what that will do is I'll take both of those values, right? So I'll take the averages and add them together, but I'll multiply the race average by 1.5. And that's because, in my opinion, it's more sort of valuable a driver's ability to execute a good race than it is qualifying, which is why I weight it slightly heavier in the overall ranking system I've made, that you'll see soon. And I think that's quite reasonable. I think that's quite reasonable, really, to say that races are more important, because I think a driver will always be assessed on how good their performances have been in the race rather than their qualifying form. Because I think, for example, you look at Charles Leclerc as an example of this, where he's got incredible qualifying form with pole positions, but pretty bad conversion rate. And I know he's seen as people commend that he's extracting the most out of the car, but ultimately, as the years go on, you'll look back at Charles Leclerc and you'll be like, kind of just waste. He wouldn't be looked as a great driver just because he qualified well, if you get what I'm saying. So that's why I think the race average is more important. And as you'll see, I'm doing that race average including DNFs. However, I will also show the averages excluding DNFs because it also brings up some insightful information that some drivers have been heavily affected by DNFs this season, and if you take that out of their average, it does actually bring them closer to certain drivers, and is kind of the reason why people think they're doing so much worse, or doing worse than they actually are. So, as you can see, I have this sort of example laid out in front for Oscar Piastri's form in Italy, Azerbaijan, and Singapore. And you can pause the screen now. It's not particularly difficult mathematics to get behind, but it's in the bottom left there for you to see as to how I'm calculating these rankings. Of course, it's over 20 races, not 3, but just so you understand where I'm getting these numbers from. And the ranking is just that. It's an abstract number. It doesn't relate to positions or anything more than that. It's just a number that I can rank the drivers from 1st to 21st, because I am including Jack Doohan in this. And that list follows as such, where there are some surprises, to be honest. And I've labelled the position changes so that you can see based off of their real standings and then my ranking standings. And I think from what the result is here, you can see sort of the validity of what I've done, because at the top, you have Piastri as, I suppose, because it's based off of averages, you could say the most consistent driver of the season. And I think that is fair. Of course, recency bias of him not performing very well, but as a season as a whole, he has been more consistent than Norris. And as you can see, it's not by much. It's not like I'm saying Norris has been absolutely terrible. He hasn't. But as you can see, Piastri edges it out as being sort of the most consistent across the whole season. And then also Verstappen has to be mentioned there in the sense that he is so close to McLaren's. And you have to remember he's had some pretty bad races in the mid part of the season. I mean, I'm thinking Hungary comes to mind, Spain comes to mind, where he finished 10th. So it's pretty impressive that Verstappen's that close to both McLaren's, and same with George Russell. I know he's a bit further back, but the fact that those top four are so close, I think it is reflected in the season. And then the Ferraris a little bit back again. I think that's quite accurate. And Antonelli quite far off of that top six, as he has been for most of the season. But the real sort of changes, which I'll go into more depth on soon, come in the sort of mid-pack to bottom end of the standings. And as you can see, big position changes for the likes of Nico Hülkenberg, Lance Stroll, and Yuki Tsunoda. And like I say, I think I'll go into it in more detail, but it is valid that these positions kind of they feel more correct than the actual real life standings, because Tsunoda hasn't had those big flashy performances, but he has been consistently, not in the bottom 5 of the championship in terms of race performance. He hasn't been. Yet that's where he stands in real life. And then you look at Hülkenberg, where he's completely inflated by the P5, was it? Or was it P4 in Spain, and the P3, obviously, podium in Silverstone. So his points tally is just massively inflated by that. And if you look at his whole season, that's why he's dropped so much. And it's the same for Lance Stroll, where he had the really good races, or fortunate races, in Melbourne, and he had a pretty good fortune in the Miami Sprint, I believe, as well, where he's just had these big point results, but in relation to his whole season, it's not been great. And to sort of dive deeper into these explanations, I'd like to go into the McLaren drivers first, where, as you can see, I have the additional data laid out with average qualifying position, average race position including DNFs, and an average race position excluding DNFs. And as you can see, Piastri has a better qualifying average, standing at third compared to Norris with 3.3. And then Piastri also edges him out on race positions on average with DNFs, but then Norris comes back at him on race positions without DNFs. And I'm fully aware that the way I've done the race positions without DNFs is basically dividing his total average by one less race, in Norris's case, because he's had an extra DNF to Piastri. And of course that's going to make his number lower, but the way I'm using it as quite valuable insight is just think of it as the races that they've completed. That's what their average is, right? So the races where you've got a actually accurate data point from their performance, that's what that number is. And Norris edges out Piastri, as you can see. And it kind of backs up the way this championship's been going, in the sense that everyone talks about Norris losing 18 points in Zandvoort, and how that's been so detrimental to his championship. I mean, obviously he's leading now, but he would have a bigger gap. And it reflects true in this, in the sense that the reason why Piastri's ahead with race position on DNFs is because Norris has had a DNF, a mechanical DNF on top of Piastri. And like you can see, that means Norris has got a lower average race position. He has been the better McLaren driver in the races on average for this season, whereas he has been the worse McLaren qualifier this season. And again, you just need to think to the beginning part of this season where races like China and Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, his qualifyings in all three of those races were really quite poor. And that's why you kind of see this Piastri being better at qualifying, because he has just been that much more consistent. I know he hasn't been recently, but that's only been 2 races that he's qualified badly. The rest of his season has been quite strong. And again, you can see Norris edges out Piastri on race wins as well. He's got 1 extra to Piastri's 6 and Norris's 7. And it kind of reflects the season. I mean, on my ranking system, Piastri is 0.4 ahead of Norris. And it really depends how you judge this, really. Because I think if we're talking about who's been the better driver season long, I think it does reflect that in Piastri. I think most people can say Piastri has been the better driver across the whole season. However, I think on pure performance, what this data reflects is that Norris is still the better of the 2 McLaren drivers. It's just he is more prone to bottling it in qualifying or the race compared to Piastri. And the weekends where Norris isn't bottling, he's completely capitalising on that, and is why he's got more race wins than Piastri. But the way Piastri stays in this championship fight is he needs to prey on Norris being more inconsistent, because on pure pace, Norris hasn't beat, and it's as simple as that, I'm afraid. So yeah, in terms of the McLaren 2, obviously the switch around in my rankings, but I think it's quite interesting to see that not only are they really close this season, but also just to see that, you know, they both have their strengths, but overall you can see how Piastri, you can see why he had that championship lead for so long, in the sense that he is just brutally consistent for most of the season, whereas Norris has those mistakes that inhibit his true pace being shown. And that's kind of enough said for the McLaren drivers, but I think another interesting sort of driver comparison is between the 3 Red Bull affiliate drivers in Tsunoda, Hadjar and Lawson, because the narrative of this season, I think, quite fairly to say, is Hadjar is widely regarded as the best or the second best of the Red Bull program, behind Verstappen, of course. And that's quite comfortable. People will not budge on that. And Tsunoda is arguably rated lower than Lawson, I'd say, in public perception. But as you can see from the data I've gathered here, is it does confirm that Hadjar is comfortably the best of the 3. So in the context of next year's drive, of who's going to get the Red Bull seat, there's definitely sufficient evidence to say Hadjar deserves that over Tsunoda. I know that the V-Carb is supposedly easier to drive than the Red Bull, so it's not a fair analysis on driver performance between Hadjar and Tsunoda, but it is a fair analysis of race results and qualifying results that Hadjar hasn't beat out. I mean, what, a 1.7 gap on qualifying positions, and then race positions without DNFs, a 0.8 gap. So quite comfortable in Hadjar's favour. But I think the real interesting comparison is not with Hadjar, because it is quite obvious he's ahead of the pair of them, but it's more so between Tsunoda and Lawson, because with all of this talk of Tsunoda potentially not even getting a Red Bull seat if he gets dropped, I mean in V-Carb as a whole, Red Bull as a whole, and the rumours of Arvid Lindblad coming in, Lawson and Lindblad being in the V-Carb and then Hadjar being in the Red Bull. There's a lot of talk around that, and it being probably the most popular theory in terms of the fate of the Red Bull program for next year. And as you can see, I think it's quite unfair to rate Tsunoda that much lower, really, because you look at average qualies, Tsunoda has comfortably beaten Lawson, with an average of around 12, and Lawson being a position further behind that. And you need to bear in mind, Lawson has been in the more sort of user-friendly car, if you will, for more of the season, because Tsunoda had the two races at the beginning of the season in the V-Carb, but the rest of it in the difficult-to-drive Red Bull. So he beats him on qualifying, he beats him on average race positions, but he doesn't on races without DNFs. And I think the main conclusion from that is Lawson has had good races in the second half of this season, but it's mostly the beginning where he was completely lacking. I mean, also with his qualifying, the 20th in China, I believe, is really damning for his averages. And I think it is reflected, like, you don't look at Lawson's season as a whole and really remember him really troubling the top positions in qualifying all too often. You often see him out in Q2, which is reflected by the fact that he has an average of around 13th. And same with the races. And, like, he hasn't been that great. He's had a few good performances. Don't get me wrong about that. Like, he had a good race in Azerbaijan. Very much deserved that. But overall, he's been quite average. In fact, very average. And same with Tsunoda. But the point is that he has been better than Lawson in terms of consistency. And the sort of, I'm not saying this to say that Tsunoda is way better than Lawson. I'm not in any means saying that. But I'm just saying that the sort of, like, you know, big decision or the big prediction of Lawson's going to edge out Tsunoda at V-Carb, I don't think that's an easy decision at all. Because you need to bear in mind that Lawson did have pre-season testing in the Red Bull. And that is very valuable. Like, 3 days of testing, like, Tsunoda not having that in the Red Bull is pretty significant and shouldn't be discounted. And I know Tsunoda's had the Red Bull for most of the season, but it still helps to get that baseline of the origin of the car, because by the second round, the engineers, or the third round for when Tsunoda joined, the engineers are already tailoring the car towards Verstappen at that point. And Tsunoda hasn't really got to grips with the base of the car because he hasn't done any of the testing. So I think Tsunoda does get a bit too much hate based off of this, because him only being the gaps he is, as you can see, off of Hadjar even, and the gaps ahead of Lawson, he has been just average. And whether average gives you the, you know, backing to stay with V-Carb after the season, I don't know, because my point is Lawson hasn't really impressed enough to say comfortably that he will be the favourite over Tsunoda. And I think perhaps because of the narrative of people being like, oh, Tsunoda's not performing to the level of the Red Bull, which is fair, I think because of that, whenever Lawson or Hadjar beat him, it's kind of bolstered more. Like, it's talked about more so than it probably would be normally. Because it's like, ooh, in the context of the Red Bull seat, that's a big result. But apart from that, I think Lawson's kind of been, like, not hyped, because he's not a hyped driver in the slightest, but, like, he's been overrated slightly because of that narrative, because in actuality he hasn't been that great. He's been solid but not that great, and And you can kind of see that with my overall rankings in the sense that Tsunoda is 1 ahead of Lawson and Hadjar is 1.4 ahead of Tsunoda. So quite a big gap between the two VCARB drivers. Like it needs to be, it can't be understated that Hadjar is comfortably clearing Lawson, even though he's had a tough last few races. In the whole season, Hadjar's been way better than Lawson. But also Tsunoda has been better than Lawson. He kind of has. And that's not to say that he's doing what he needs to for the Red Bull seat, but he kind of has been in that average sort of 11th, 12th, 13th position, which is better than Lawson, who's had some very good results, thinking of like Monaco, for example, as well. But overall just quite peaky in the sense that he's had those good results, but a lot of the season he has been way further down. And yes, he has been affected by DNFs, as reflected by the lower average race position without DNFs. But it just has been like a couple good results, but a lot of anonymous results. And I think that does need to be weighted into people's minds more, in the sense that it's easy to hate on the underperforming Red Bull driver, as it was with Sergio in 24. But I think with actual data behind it, you need to cut Yuki a little bit of slack, because he hasn't been as bad as it actually seems, based off of this. Although, again, with the Q3 appearances, Tsunoda with 8, Hadjar with 12, it just shows how good Hadjar's been, really. And I know it's a lot of glazing, but like, he just has been that good for his rookie season. It's quite incredible that out of 20 rounds, 12 Q3 performances. That's very impressive for a rookie. And if he does get the Red Bull seat next year, it's very deserved based off of that, because what more can you expect from him on his first season in the sport? So that's that on the Red Bull camp of things. But I'd also like to talk about Sauber, because the thing I find interesting is it's been a season of two halves, really, for Sauber in terms of their drivers. I think at this current point of time, people probably would rate Bortoleto as being better than Hulkenberg in terms of recent performance, which he has been. But also, at the sort of midpoint of the season, everyone was like hyping up Hulkenberg because he got the podium in Silverstone and the sort of really good result in Spain. And in the standings, compared to my rankings, obviously Hulkenberg's lost a lot of positions, because of all of the drivers on the grid, he probably has the most peaky season, in the sense that he's had really, really big points hauls in a couple races, but the rest he's been absolutely nowhere. Whereas Bortoleto is kind of the opposite of this, where a lot of the sort of earlier races and later races, he's been consistently close to the top 10, but then he hasn't had too many big points scoring races. And you can kind of see that with, on average, Bortoleto is better at qualifying than Hulkenberg. That sort of 2024 Hulkenberg in the Haas has just seemingly disappeared this season, where his performance in qualifying has actually been quite poor. And I know Crofty always loves to mention this recently, where it's like, oh, Hulkenberg's not been good in qualifying this season. And it's true. He's really not been that great, and quite comfortably outperformed by his rookie teammate in qualifying, which I don't think many people would have expected this season, given how strong he was last year. But then the interesting part of the data comes in with the average race positions, where Hulkenberg beats Bortoleto on both. And I think part of this is because people have forgotten that Bortoleto actually didn't have that great of a beginning of the season compared to Hulkenberg, because recently Bortoleto has been consistently better in every aspect to Hulkenberg. in the last few races, barring a few outliers. However, at the beginning of the season, both not only was the Sauber not particularly good, but also Hulkenberg in that sort of battle between the sort of bottom 15 positions, Hulkenberg quite consistently beat Bortoleto, and that's why his average has sort of come down and is better in the races. And I do think it is kind of like reasonable to see that in the sense that I think most people would say Hulkenberg has had better race performances than Bortoleto this season. Because Bortoletto's only really had like Austria comes to mind, where he got points, and also he had a good drive in Mexico most recently. He's had a couple good drives, but overall, I think because of the recency of it, he's getting a little bit overhyped, in my opinion, because as you can see, his average performances have been worse than Hulkenberg, and it's only because of the sort of time span of, or the time nature of the recency of his good results is to why people are saying that he's better than he actually has been. And that's not to lower like his accolades this season, because considering he is a rookie, he has done extremely well to be this close to Hulkenberg. It's very impressive. And his qualifying as well. I mean, you can see 4 Q3 appearances to Hulkenberg's 0. So his qualifying is nothing to scoff at. Like, very, very good. But I think it's kind of the same we saw with Piastri in his first year at McLaren, where he's close-ish or better on qualifying, but it's that lack of race experience that's really hurting Bortoleto. And you need to remember that Hulkenberg has also had some bad fortune for his races, where I'm thinking, I don't think he took the start in Monza, and he basically DNF'd pretty instantly in Mexico as well. So I think it's fair to say Hulkenberg has had the better season. And of course, it sounds obvious saying that when he's had the podium, but that podium kind of was A, an outlier, and B, largely down to strategy rather than absolute driver brilliance. Not to discredit his performance, but it wasn't completely driver skill that. It was a combination of the driver and the team. But yeah, that all results in Hulkenberg being 0.1 up on Bortoleto in my rankings. And I think that's quite reasonable, really. Like I say, very impressive from Bortoleto to be this close. And based off of current form in the last 4 races, potentially Bortoleto surpasses Hulkenberg in A, the average race positions, and B, the ranking because of that. Because the momentum definitely is with Gabriel, and, you know, if he does manage to beat Hulkenberg this season, obviously not in the point standings because he's way ahead, but in my rankings, then I think that's in contention for Rookie of the Year, really. Because at the beginning of the season, most people would have predicted Hulkenberg to comfortably beat Bortoleto, I think. I think that's fair to say. And he's definitely been one of the biggest surprises this season, has Bortoleto. So, with Sauber done, I'd like to move on to Aston Martin. Oh god, how my team's fallen, I mean, yikes. But the more, regardless of the team performance, I think the more talkative, or the bigger talking point here is, my god, how bad Stroll is. I mean, you know, he has his days where he's good, right? But just look at these stats. I mean, 10.9 for Alonso in qualifying, 16.2 for Stroll. I mean, wow. And then race positions kind of gets a bit closer with 12.4 on Alonso and 13.7 for Stroll. But as I'm immediately going to counter, is Alonso has been plagued with a lot of unfortunate DNFs this season. which is why his average without DNFs is so much lower at 10.5 and kind of reflects his actual form this season. Whereas Stroll, to my surprise actually, going through the data of the races, he hasn't had a DNF this season. 0 DNFs for Stroll. So you can give that to his credit, I guess, if you value that. But it doesn't help him at all in terms of averages, because just way off of Alonso. I mean, look at his Q1 exits as well. 13 to Alonso's 2. If you weren't a fan of the sport and you just purely looked at Stroll's results, disregarding championship points, because like I've said, you can see from the data here that is completely misconceiving of his actual performance. He has been way down on that this season. But if you were just a complete new fan and you looked at Stroll's performance on the screen here, you'd think the Aston Martin is like the second worst car every weekend. Like, you'd be fair for thinking that. But it's just ridiculous how he's making that car look so bad when Alonso's showing that it does have decent potential on its day, with really impressive, like, 10.9 qualifying average and 10.5 without DNF's race average. Like, he's pulling the maximum out of that car, but Stroll is just woefully off the pace. I mean, on my ranking system, 3.7 behind Alonso. That's massive. And, of course there's the ever eternal debate of, well, it's not really a debate, but he'll never lose a seat because of his dad owning the team. And it's like, you look at stats like this and you despair. If you had a driver even slightly closer to Alonso, that team would probably be very close to Williams in the constructors' standings this year. But no, you're stuck with Stroll, who, his average qualifying position puts him out in Q1 with 16th, as reflected with 13 out of 20 Q1 exits. The only one positive I will give to Stroll, and it always has been like this with him, is that he miraculously just locks in races. His qualifying is terrible, but for some reason, as you can see with a 16.2 in qualifying and a 13.7 in the races, he somehow has decent race. I wouldn't say craft, because he does have some pretty bad incidents, but he has decent race fortune, let's say, in the sense that it's just that you saw it a lot in 2022, for example, with him against Vettel, where you just see Stroll out in Q1 in qualifying, and then you'll get to the end of like lap 10, and you'll just be like, how the hell has Stroll appeared in 10th or 9th? Like, he just kind of appears out of nowhere in semi-decent racing positions. So I'll give that to his credit, but just terribly off of Alonso's pace. I mean, out-qualified every race this season. There's just not much good that can be said behind it. And with the averages taken into account, because obviously in the championship standings, they are quite close, because Stroll had the very good race in Melbourne, for example. But in actuality, he has been way off, and actually the third worst, or actually the worst full-time driver this season, which, is crazy. It's absolutely crazy when Alonso is in the top 10. Like, terrible. Absolutely terrible. But, are we surprised? No. Do we kind of, as a community, get some sort of enjoyment out of laughing at Stroll's sort of like bad performances? I think we do. So even if he stays in that seat forever, we'll still get some entertainment out of it, is my point. And you know what? It makes Alonso look better. So I'll take it. Hopefully next year. I mean, it will be interesting next year, actually, if Aston Martin is a strong car. with Adrian Newey, of course. It'll be very interesting to see what Stroll does. Whether he's good in a good car and just bad in a bad performing car, we'll soon see. Because it'll be quite funny if you see Aston Martin as the best car, and you see Stroll with consistent podiums. That would be quite a sight to see. I shouldn't get my hope up too much because I'm so used to absolute misery with this team. But something to ponder for next year. Will we see a Stroll Ayrton Senna conversion? Maybe. But disregarding that, I'd also like to lastly talk about Williams, because an ongoing sort of debate this season has been the comparison between Albon and Sainz, where very fairly said is the beginning of the season, Albon was leagues clear of Sainz. And you can see that carries on with my ranking system, with him being 1.2 ahead of Sainz in the standings. So that is reflected, but the reason why I've done this whole video is because it delves deeper into more insightful things, in the sense of Sainz has been the better qualifier this season, and he's had terrible performances at the start of the season in races, but you need to think of, like, for example, Saudi Arabia. Sainz outqualifies Albon there, does terribly in the race, well, not terribly, but not amazing in the race, as reflected for the first part of the season. But my point is that quite consistently he has been ahead of Albon in qualifying, and again backed up by 9 Q3 performances to Albon's 8. So Sainz, I mean, as we've all seen, his pitfall this season has been sort of just racecraft, I'd say, and he has had a couple things go out of his control, but he's just had a lot of incidents. Like, I'm thinking his crash at Melbourne in the first race of the season. He had a recent DNF in Austin where he just sent it on Kimi. I think he had a missed opportunity in Miami against the two Ferraris. The point is, he's had a lot of bad performances in racing, but the important stat here is that you'd think, with Sainz having quite a few DNFs, you'd think that the average race without DNFs would go in his favour. But actually, Albon's had 3 DNFs in a row this season, and without that, you can see his average race position is 9.1 in the races he's completed. And that's just really impressive from him. Like, he's really stepped up this season, and obviously it is reflected in the standings as a whole, with him being the leader of the midfield. But I think in this recent form where Sainz has been better than Albon, it needs to be remembered more that Albon has been the better driver of the two, like, comfortably. And you can see that with race positions without DNFs of 10.6 to Sainz's 12.9. I think if Sainz continues his current form, then it will of course get closer. But I think Albon is just at a sort of position of quite misfortunate races and misfortunate qualifying sessions, where I don't think we've really seen a true comparison. At the moment, people are lauding Sainz for consistently beating Albon, which he is, but I don't think we've really seen a representative Albon performance recently. We haven't. Like, in Austin, his qualifying, it was a bottle job, but it's the same conversation with Lando Norris, right? Where, like, it was a bottle, but we don't know whether he was the faster driver. That's kind of the point. Like, you can see across the season, he has been the faster driver in, like, in pretty much all of the races, except for the last few. So I think it's interesting between the two Williams drivers, really, where I think Sainz, of course, he's doing well now, but I do think he is quite overrated as a driver. He did well in Ferrari, of course, right? And of course, beat Charles Leclerc in 2021 in the standings. But I do think he is just quite mediocre. And look, maybe this is a hot take. I don't know. But I think this kind of performance in Williams was to be expected with Albon beating him. And obviously, like before the season, people were hyping up Sainz to beat Albon. But I I think it like I say, you kind of had to expect it. Because I think he gets hyped up too much for the fact that the Ferrari in the seasons he was there was a very good car. But Charles Leclerc had his number quite consistently. I know Sainz did have his days, but Charles Leclerc was quite far ahead as well. I mean, look at 2022. Like, Charles Leclerc was way ahead of Sainz that year. Way ahead. And I just think he's quite an average driver, and I'm not at all surprised to see these kind of results. And he is a good qualifier. I'll give him that. He's been better than Albon, but I think as we draw closer to the end of this season, Albon definitely goes down as the best of the midfield, and I don't think the results Sainz can do at the end can really counter that. And I know, of course, he had his podium in Baku, and he had the sprint podium, which I don't really count because it was just lucky, with drivers ahead crashing. So he has had his peaky performances, but that's exactly the point. He's had a lot of very, very bad races, whereas Albon has had a lot of really, really good races. Not quite the, like, jaw-dropping performances, but he's had a lot of really good, solid fifth places, for example. And then his off days generally tend to be sort of like the 13th, 12th positions, whereas Sainz is way lower than that. So I just think it's interesting to look at that comparison, because the gap between the two is quite big at 1.2. It's one of the bigger teammate gap comparisons on my ranking system. So I think going into 2026, it's going to be interesting to see how these two do, because the momentum, of course, is on Sainz at the moment, but I think we haven't seen Albon's best the last few races, whereas we have seen Sainz's best. I think if we see Albon's best, it's going to be interesting between those two, is all I'll say. So that's kind of my overall analysis on some of the interesting comparisons. As you can see, I've got the complete ordered ranking in front of me again. And I suppose another few notable ones is Doohan against Colapinto, I guess. He's higher, but that's the one sort of pitfall between those two and this ranking, is that, of course, Doohan had less races than Colapinto. And also, yeah, just the Alpine was better when he was driving. Like, that was back when Gasly was getting like P5 finishes in Bahrain, I believe. So I think that's the only sort of teammate comparison that's a bit skewed. I'd put Colapinto above him. But also Colapinto being quite far off of Gasly, even with less races, is quite interesting. Because people keep saying that, like, they're really close, but it's like they're battling like at the back. Do you really think they're putting their full effort into that? I mean, that's just my opinion. I personally don't rate that highly. Yes, he has been close and beating Gasly in some races, but do you really see Colapinto as that driver who's going to bring home like a P8 finish when they've got the chance? I personally don't. I think that's why Gasly is so far ahead. Of course, he did have the better Alpine at the start of the season, but I think it's fair to say Gasly's still ahead. And then I suppose another interesting comparison is Behrman and Ocon, which I'll just briefly say is, like, Ocon has been quite anonymous this season, like very anonymous. And I think it's a testament to Behrman that as his full-time rookie season, he's quite comfortably beating him in the standings. Well, not in the standings, but in this ranking. Because he's just been consistent, whereas Ocon has just consistently been very low. Like he had very fortunate races like China, for example, and he did have a good race in Monaco, to be fair. But I think this is exactly why I wanted to make this video on, and this data is that it really exposes the drivers who benefit a lot from good fortune, and it really upholsters the ones who have actually been the better drivers across the whole season, and pretty unanimously I think that's reflected quite well here. And it just really shows how the actual standings can be very deceptive for driver performance, which is the main point I'm getting at in this video. And I hope you guys agree with that. I think maybe Hulkenberg being below Ocon, for example, is a bit harsh, but overall, I'm very happy with this. I think it really reflects truly how the drivers have been. And I will continue. I might add these race by race to my race previews, or race reviews, should I say. So I might add the updates to this in those, if you guys are interested in that. But also, I will link I'll give the link to the actual data Google Sheets that I've made. So you guys can use that for yourself if you'd want. Just create a copy of it. I will update it, so it's not in any way, shape or form close to the final result. But I will change this, probably more for next year. But I will keep it updated. And I hope you guys enjoyed that. Just overall, having a bit more of a debate on drivers' true performance, on average, compared to sort of the narratives that we've had this season. Because I think there are a few drivers that have been done quite dirty in terms of perception when their seasons haven't been that bad. So yeah, let me know if you want more sort of videos like this, sort of like more analysis kind of things. And I should be making a video for the Brazilian preview very soon. So that will go out before the race, of course. And like I say, let me know in the comments what kind of things you want to see. I'm very happy to suggestions, to listen to you guys. Any sort of feedback, of course, as well. And like and subscribe if you like the video. And I'll see you in the next one. Thank you very much. Goodbye.